in the worst spot. It's driving me crazy. I don't know what the heck it is. I don't know what's happened, but it's bothering me.
priced the USSR for different values of different people based on their skills and job set. For example, a general labor might bring 1,800, which was, whereas a doctor could bring 15,000. Not very enough of the reading requirements, but I do find it kind of hypocritical that the communist government, the same government that supposedly is striving to create a communist classless society where everybody is equal, is also taking political prisoners, assigning different values to their life based on their ability to produce economic output, almost like they're putting them into separate classes, implying that some people are worth more than others, and then they're turning around and trying to sell them to another government for money, which is allegedly something else they don't want, which is weird. It's almost like they're talking words and bullshit, so we can have a bunch of people. Like, it is all kind of what is it going to take to convince you that communism bullshit? No. In addition to 30,000 prisoners of the USSR essentially auctioned off for money, they also released 215,000 East German citizens for a low price of $2.5 billion. Between 1945 and 1989, killed from east to west Germany or from east to west Berlin. And that is considered to be a very low, very conservative number because the USSR didn't want to release the actual numbers or admit that they killed anyone, because every single person they killed trying to escape communism was a huge political hit to them. Which raises the question, what happened in 1989? Well, that's the best part of the whole story. By 1989, the Soviet Union was going bankrupt. They were beginning to crumble. They were losing their sphere of influence, and more civil unrest started to occur. And by November of 1989, in East Germany, there were protests, people demanding that they have the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, the ability to critique their government without getting arrested, and most importantly, the freedom of travel. The communist government knew they had to give the people an inch before the people turned around and took a mile. And the 1 inch they were willing to give them was they were going to get rid of the travel ban and finally start granting people visas. They weren't going to charge them money. They weren't going to have some special circumstance to do it. And most importantly, they were actually going to approve people, and they were going to do it quickly. These new travel regulations were drafted on November 8th. They were going to be announced to the public on November 9th on live TV. And on November 10th, they would go into effect, and people could show up at the passport office, apply, and ideally get accepted and have the freedom to travel west. And that's kind of what happened. November 8th, the new regulations get drafted. That's fine. November 9th, they hand the new regulations to a government spokesperson by the name of Gunter Schabowski, and he's going to read them on a government press conference on live TV. He didn't have time to read through all the papers. Nobody took the time to explain it to him, so on live TV, he just kind of wings it. We'll do it live! And he reads off what he thinks is important, which is just, here's the new rules that we're living by, and everybody's like pretty happy about it. And one journalist asks, when does this go into effect? And Gunter, not having time to have read through all the papers, kind of shuffles through them real quick, looking for an effective date, in which he doesn't see one. It's there, he just doesn't see it. So he just kind of shrugs, and he's like, as far as I know, quote, immediately, without delay.
Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort.
And with that, going out on live TV, East Germans got up and started going to the wall. Now, this announcement was at the ass end of a boring government press conference, so not a lot of people saw it. But then the news outlets started picking it up, and they started airing it, both in East and West Germany. And then even more people started showing up on both sides of the wall. And within just a few hours, tens of thousands of people had shown up to Checkpoint Charlie, one of the main checkpoints for the Berlin Wall, to go from east to west. And they demanded to be let go because they had just been told by their government on live TV that they had the freedom of travel. And the guards had no idea what was going on, and they were outnumbered tens of thousands to 1. And eventually the guards were forced to simply let people through. And then word spread that they actually let them through. And all of Berlin, both east and west, came out and had basically the biggest block party the world has ever seen, as a city that had been divided in half for 28 years was finally reunited. And then they celebrated this reunification by tearing down the wall that had separated them for so long. In conclusion, Germany after World War II is the closest thing to a controlled experiment that you can have, pitting capitalism against communism to see which one would triumph in real life. They took one country with one people, divided it down the middle, and gave each a set of rules to live by. And while capitalism is far from perfect and it has a ton of things that we can improve upon, I think the results of this experiment speak for themselves. So thank you for watching. Best way to support the channel is to buy some merch. FatElectrician.com. Black Bang out.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Gemini. What do I do? Well, we can have a conversation.
About anything?
Yeah. I can help with things like brainstorming, explaining something you don't quite understand, or even just chat about whatever's on your mind.
Marshall's buyers hustle for the latest trends so that you don't have to. Dudleyville is back. So chic.
This is hands down going to be the longest video I've ever made. There's probably pee first. Hold on. Today we're talking about America's airborne anti-hero. Ladies and gentlemen, James Elbert McNeese, a.k.a. Jake McNasty, the leader of one of the most notorious military groups of all time, the Filthy 13. And just to clarify, in case you don't know, being an anti-hero is not a bad thing, despite how it may sound. You see, the textbook definition of an anti-hero is a hero that does not display typical heroic qualities, which honestly is pretty ambiguous, but it's one of those things where you know it when you see it. So, for example, a regular hero would be somebody like Superman. He's invincible, he shoots lasers from his eyes, and he always does the right thing 100% of the time. He never roughs up the bad guy. He always takes him straight to jail because the justice system never messes up anything. He only has sex in a missionary position. He always changes the batteries in his smoke detectors on time. It's boring, unrelatable, and completely inhuman behavior. Anyways, and then you have the anti-heroes, the fan favorites, the characters with human faults that they not only overcome but turn into their advantage. Characters like Wolverine with his bad attitude, Deadpool with his morbid sense of humor. Hell, even Batman is an anti-hero because at the end of the day, it's more relatable to do karate in your garage, dress up like a bat, and then run around town beating up clowns and dudes on steroids than it is to be perfect. Yup! So I guess what it means to be an anti-hero is that you always do the right thing, but you don't always do it the right way. And if you were to ask me for a real-life example of an anti-hero, I can't give you a better one than Jake McNeese. Alright, here's the deal. Jake was born in Oklahoma in 1919. He grew up during the Great Depression as one of 10 siblings. This guy had to learn how to hunt, fish, and trap just to help put food on his family's table so they could survive. He had his first full-time job when he was 10 years old and continued to work full-time all the way through high school. After graduating, he became a full-time firefighter. Shortly after that, the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. America entered World War II. Jake, however, was exempt from the draft because he was a firefighter, but that's not what Jake wanted. Jake wanted to volunteer, and he didn't just want to volunteer for anything. Jake wanted to be a paratrooper and a demolition man. Jake wanted to jump out of a perfectly good plane behind enemy lines with a couple of buddies, be completely surrounded, and have nothing more than a gun and some explosives, and just go out there and deprive the enemy of nice things. Got a bridge? Guess what? Now you don't. Nice power lines, it'd be a shame if somebody blew those up. That's what Jake wanted to do, and that's what he was gonna do. So at the age of 22, Jake set off for training. Upon arriving in training, Jake pretty much immediately establishes himself as being incredible in any task the Army can throw at him, but also a humongous pain in the ass in his entire chain of command. During his very first week in the Army, Jake got in a fist fight with the staff sergeant in charge of the chow hall because the staff sergeant wouldn't give him butter with his bread. At which point, the entire chain of command is like, on one hand, we have to get rid of this guy. He's a loose cannon. You absolutely cannot be attacking staff sergeants as a private. He's got to go. But on the other hand, this is exactly the type of behavior we're looking for somebody who want to drop behind enemy lines and expect to fuck up everything. So they just kind of let it slide. Fast forward a couple of weeks, Jake is doing a demolition course, and he ends up setting the course record. He is the fastest person to ever complete this course. At which point, his leadership walks up and is like, "Hey, soldier, congratulations, you broke the record." Jake looks the guy in the eye and goes, "Yeah, if you think that's impressive, you should see what I can do when I have some butter once in a while." And that pretty much sets the tone for the rest of Jake's training. He absolutely crushes any task they give him, but also, Jake does not give a single fuck about the dog and pony show that is the U.S. military. He's not going to call an officer sir or ma'am. He's going to call them by their nickname. He's not going to salute them because they salute him first. He's not going to stand outside and salute the flag and retreat. And he absolutely is not going to show up in formation on time, and he's definitely not going to be sober all the time, because that's just how Jake is. And because of this, Jake would be the only recruit cannot get promoted to PFC, which is a way bigger deal than it sounds like, because at this point in time, in the 101st Airborne and the 82nd Airborne, every single new recruit after 31 days of training got promoted to private first class. The reasoning behind that was they wanted to give these guys a promotion so they can make more money and ideally send that money back home to their families because, well, they've got a very dangerous job and nobody knows what's going to happen. So absolutely everybody is being promoted to PFC after 31 days except for Jake. But here's the thing, Jake didn't really care. Jake wasn't there for the money. He was there for one thing and one thing only.
We're going to be doing one thing only, doing that.
So Jake is now the lowest ranking person in his entire company, and leadership was hoping that Jake would take this as a sign that he should start cooperating and get it together. That doesn't really happen, though, and leadership now has no idea what to do with Jake. Because on one hand, he's way too valuable to lose, but on the other hand, they don't want him mingling with all the other soldiers, rubbing off on them in a bad way. So they take Jake, they stick him in his very own platoon, all by himself, and make him his own acting platoon sergeant. And then, as time passes, whenever they get another soldier just like Jake, they would send him over to join Jake's platoon, and he would eventually get 4 members in his platoon, counting him for a total of 5, and they would become known as the Dirty 5. And from there, things would obviously get really out of hand. Fast forward, Jake and his men finish the first phase of their training, and they are given a pass to go out on the town one last time before they have to go to Fort Benning for airborne school. So Jake and his men, his men that all outrank him because he's still technically a private, but he's also somehow their platoon sergeant. They all go out, they go to the bar, they get drunk. They end up running into some MPs. One of his men starts living off of the MPs. The MP goes to beat him with a nightstick. Jake interferes and says, hey, he's really drunk, let it slide. In Jake's own words, and I quote, he's so drunk he couldn't hit the floor with his hat in 30 throws. Okay, so just let it slide, he's going to get his men back to the barracks, it's going to be fine. The military police, the MP, then tells Jake, mind his own business as he turns around and hit Jake's guy with a nightstick, at which point Jake proceeds to beat the shit out of 2 MPs, taking their Colt 45 1911s, firing all the ammunition into a nearby street sign before handing them back their empty guns and saying, okay, now you can take me to jail. The next morning, Jake's commanding officer shows up to the stockade to talk to Jake, and he's like, look, not surprised you're here, don't really care what happened. Here's the deal. The Japanese have a world record for the longest ruck march, and I want to break that record by having a group of guys march from here all the way to Fort Benning, 136 miles. And I think you and your men are some of the guys that are going to be able to pull it off. Are you in? At which point, McNeese is like, 136 miles isn't a problem at all. I won't change my socks, and I won't even get a blister. Which, if you've never been in the military and you've never ruck marched, saying that you're not going to change your socks or get a blister on a 136-mile fucking ruck march is an unprecedented amount of shit talking. It's like a NASCAR driver saying he's going to win the Daytona 500 without having his tires changed a single time. It's like going out drinking, ending up at Taco Bell at 2 in the morning, eating a bunch of steak quesadillas, waking up the next day, taking a shit without wiping. Okay, it's not possible. So then the commanding officer is like, great, cool, I'll see you at the ruck march. We're going to go ahead and leave you in the stockade for the next 10 days. Until then, though, Jake's like, cool, no problem, I'll hang out. 10 days later shows up. Jake is in a prison uniform with a giant P on the front, and 3 MPs show up with 12-gauge shotguns loaded. And they escort Jake to the starting line of this fucking ruck march like he's Hannibal Lecter. There, he changes into a normal uniform and takes off on a 136-mile ruck march to Fort Benning so he can go to airborne school. And sure enough, true to his word, Jake is one of only 75 men to finish this ruck march, and he did not change his socks, and he did not get a single blister, which I cannot stress to you enough is a superhuman feat. They're taking his men go on to do airborne training, absolutely no problem, nothing really of note happens here, except for the fact that Jake is still a private and still not been promoted in anything. After completing airborne training, Jake and his men are going to go to Kansas, North Carolina, where they're going to receive expert saboteur training. They'll be receiving expert training in demolitions. They'll be receiving training in how to drive tanks, how to drive bulldozers, how to drive excavators, how to drive trains. Pretty much anything and everything they can teach these guys to be able to wreak havoc on enemy infrastructure is what they're learning in Camp North Carolina. Jake and his men continue to do what they do. They wreck every task that they're given. It goes perfect. Jake and his men are now about to go to England, at which point they are given one last pass to go out on the town one last time before they ship off. So Jake and his men go out drinking. Somehow or another, they end up in this little tiny diner neighboring a train yard, at which point one of the trains pulls up, stops, walks across all the other tracks, and the conductors go in and they start eating in this diner. Jake is super drunk. He's like, I don't want to walk back to the base. I'm stealing that train. And that's exactly what he does because he just taught him how to drive trains. So Jake proceeds to steal a train and drive it all the way back to just outside of Camp Hall, where he abandons the train, goes in, and goes to bed. But everybody knows Jake did it. Nobody's turning him in, so Jake gets away with it again. And now Jake and his men are off to England. So Jake and his men arrive in England. At this point, Jake has 13 men in his platoon, including himself, and they all come to the same exact conclusion: English food fucking sucks, which is on par with every opinion that I've ever heard. Which seems weird to me because it's a country that took over most of the known world for the sake of trading spices, and apparently nobody came to the conclusion that, hey, maybe you should put some on the food. But whatever. Because the food sucks, Jake decides, hey, I'm a master at hunting and fishing and all this other stuff. I'm just going to kill enough animals to feed my entire platoon by myself. And that's exactly what he does. The only difference is he has military-grade equipment. Jake is going out in the woods at night with a spotlight and an M1 Grand, and as soon as a set of eyes looks at him, it's getting blown smithereens. Jake has his men going out fishing with explosives. Okay, they are eating everything. A couple of problems with that. One, there's strict water rationing going on. Soldiers are only allowed to have one shower a week is how little water they have to spare. So all 13 of his men come together and they decide, hey, we're just not going to take showers and we're going to use all of our water rations to clean and cook all of this game that we're killing. And because now they started stinking, they would all become known as the Filthy 13. The other problem with that was apparently all of the game was technically the property of the king, and the only people that were allowed to hunt it were the lords and ladies of the land, which definitely was not Jake Peace and the Filthy 13. So Sir Ernest Wells ends up figuring out what Jake's been doing. He gets super pissed, ends up suing the government for like $10,000 for all the animals that Jake and the Filthy 13 ate. The entire unit gets in a bunch of trouble, and Jake's kind of just like, I mean, what are you gonna do? I was hungry, so I ate some food. What do you want from me? If I'm in trouble, go ahead and punish me. What are you going to do? Stick me in an airplane, make me jump out into enemy territory where a bunch of Germans are going to try to kill me? Joke's on you, I'm into that shit. And the entire military is just kind of like, yeah, we literally have no way to punish him. So he gets away with it yet again. Fast forward June 5th, 1944. The Navy made Jake and the Filthy 13 were given a separate, extremely dangerous mission of going out, capturing, and occupying enemy held units that's supposed to be able to help Allied tanks penetrate further inland. After a day, they'll be reinforced from troops landing on Utah Beach. And if Jake can't capture and occupy the bridge, he is to blow it up so that the enemy can't use it. This mission is deemed extremely dangerous and borderline impossible, but leadership figures, if anybody can pull it off, it's going to be Jake and the 13, because let's face it, the entire command structure at this point in time is basically looking at Jake's location like a fragmentation grenade of fuckery and bad attitude that they finally get defeated. So after Jake and the men go up to start boarding the C-47 and take off at midnight to jump into Normandy. At which point Jake decides that he's going to whip out his spray razor and shave himself a muscle. He tells everybody that he's part Choctaw Native American and meant to honor that heritage. However, in reality, while he was part Choctaw, he had heard that Germany had a lice epidemic and wanted to go there with as little hair as possible. Regardless, his men followed suit, all shaved mohawks. They then begin donning black face paint, at which point Jake is like, this is cool, but we can make it. So he goes over to the C-47 that had a fresh white stripe painted outside of it to identify criminals. Oh, the paint was still wet, so he runs his fingers through the paint and goes around painting all of his men's face with white face paint as well. Unbeknownst to Jake and the Filthy 13, there were camera crews there taking pictures and recording them, and they would actually end up going viral, and the entire nation would be captivated by the unique and dangerous look of these men as they prepare to jump into enemy home territory. So much so that it would actually inspire a movie to be made known as The Dirty Dozen, and Jake and his men would be none the wiser to any of it until after World War II. June 6, 1944, Jake, the Filthy 13, and 18,000 other paratroopers take off the C-47s as they prepare to jump behind enemy lines before the amphibious invasion. About 20 miles from the targeted drop zone, Jake's plane gets hit with enemy flak fire and is losing altitude, and they have to bail out. Moments after the geese jumped out of the plane, the entire plane explodes, killing some of the Filthy 13 and scattering the rest miles apart. So Jake lands, he's completely unharmed, and he's all over the equipment. The only problem is he doesn't have any other Americans anywhere near him. So he just kind of takes off, he gets in a couple of long-range firefights with the Germans, takes a couple of them out to close quarters combat, and he's just going around trying to find any other paratroopers to group up with. And it's going on for hours and hours, and he can't find anybody. And he's starting to think maybe the whole thing was a catastrophe. Maybe it got called off. Maybe I'm the only guy out here right now. What am I going to do? And he finally comes across one other American paratrooper, and it's a machine gunner that lost track of his machine gun during the jump. And this guy is running around Normandy with nothing but a belt of machine gun ammunition and no gun. And Jake is like, Jesus, okay, well, you're with me now, yes, here's my grenades, you take those, I'm gonna keep my M1 Garand, follow me. So now Jake and Grenade guys set off to find more paratroopers. So they keep looking, they find somewhere, they find a squad of border guys, they find some guys over here, some guys over here. Slowly, Jake amasses an entire platoon of about 35 paratroopers, and they're all gonna help Jake in his mission to take out this bridge. So Jake and start making their way to go blow up this bridge, at which point they would eventually come up on an entire American unit being led by this colonel, and the colonel is like, hey, you're working for me now, I don't care about that bridge, I need you to go pull security over on this part over here. McNeese tried arguing with the colonel, but the colonel wasn't having it. He gave a direct order, and McNeese is like, okay, fine, whatever, I'll take my 35 guys, and we'll go guard this for you. So they take off, headed there. They get to the point they're supposed to guard, and McNeese just keeps walking because it was the same direction as the bridge. All of his men are like, hey, we're supposed to stop here. McNeese is like, you do what you want. I have to go take care of this bridge. You can come with me. I'd appreciate it. If not, stay here and guard it. I really don't care. All of the men go with Jake and proceed to make their way to this bridge. So Jake and his men show up to the bridge, they capture it, they build up some fortified fighting positions because they now have to hold it for a day until reinforcements from Utah Beach can arrive. So the Germans start showing up, they fight the Germans back every time. 1 day passes, no reinforcements. Day 2, they keep fighting the Germans back, hold the bridge, no reinforcements show up. Day 3, the Germans are now on the other end of the bridge with Jake and his men over here, and it's just no man's land in between on the actual bridge. When suddenly, an entire squadron of P-51 Mustangs comes up and blows up the entire bridge. Because apparently the American leadership determined there's no way Jake was going to be successful in his mission, so they blew up the bridge anyways. Thankfully, Jake and his men will make it out okay. None of them were harmed in the blast from the P-51. Now, at this point, Jake decides, hey, we're going to continue to hold our position here, because if anybody is going to try to cross this ravine, we're going to do it right here where the bridge used to be. And sure enough, an entire German infantry battalion shows up on the other side of where this bridge was. At this point, the German officers make their way through the ravine and up to Jake under a white flag where they're like, hey, go ahead and surrender. We've got 700 men. You've got 35. It's going to be a bloodbath. Just call it a day. Jake, being Jake, is like, no, but you're welcome to surrender to me. The German officer, thoroughly annoyed, is like, what are you doing in that Mohawk head of yours? I have 700 men. You need to surrender or I'm going to kill all of you. At which point, I'm paraphrasing here, but I would assume Jake said something along the lines of, yeah, you've got 700 men, but you're going that way, and the battlefield is that way, which tells me that all my buddies showed up on Utah Beach, and they've been kicking your ass so bad that now you're trying to run away from it. So, the way I figure it, you've got about 3 options. Option A, you surrender to me right here, right now, and you all live happily ever after. Option B, you go back to your men, you hold your position right where you're at, and all my buddies show up in a little bit with a bunch of Sherman tanks and proceed to un-German engineer all of you motherfuckers. And option C, you guys try to fight your way through this ravine with me guarding it, which to be honest, I would recommend the least. I have the high ground, I have fortified machine gun positions, and you've got to make your way through a ravine first, meaning that I basically also have a phone. So, I will effectively be going medieval on your ass if you choose option C. Now, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, but if I was you, I would pick option A, because if you pick option B or option C, I can pretty much guarantee that the next piece of officer correspondence that you're going to get is going to be from fucking Ouija board. At this point, the German officer storms off with his hair on fire. He's absolutely pissed. Jake then goes over to his men and he's like, hey, get ready for a fight. I'm pretty sure I just poked the bear. We'll see what happens. Sure enough, like an hour later, 700 German infantrymen proceed to take off and attempt to bomb rush Jake and his men in the fortified fighting positions. Now, I don't know what you know about military tactics, but generally speaking, it is a terrible idea to run face first into machine gun fire. It's also a terrible idea to try to fight the enemy when they have the high ground. If you don't believe me, ask Anakin. But running face first into a fortified machine gun position through a boat while they have the high ground, and the men running the machine guns are under the command of some American with a Mohawk, Native American face paint, who everybody calls Jake McNasty, is literally a lifetime supply worth of shitty ideas. Jake and his men would hold their fire until the majority of the Germans made their way into the water, at which point they would open fire with 4 heavy cruiser machine guns, 2 mortar tubes, and a bunch of small arms, effectively mowing down and decimating the entire German battalion. On that day, Jake and his ragtag group of paratroopers were credited with removing 700 enemy combatants from the field. Shortly after that, the reinforcements from Utah Beach show up. Jake goes over to a small town, they get put in a holding position for a little while. Then Jake's small group of ragtag paratroopers all get evac, where they get broken up and sent back to their original units, where they get regrouped and refitted to return to war. Jake McNeese would find himself getting evac all the way back to France, where he would be reunited with the 5 surviving members of the Filthy 13, as well as receiving a bunch of new recruits recruits for his platoon. At this point, they had a couple weeks off where they could drink, relax, do whatever. Jake's going out, he's getting drunk, he's having a good time. Then he received word that his platoon was going to be partaking in a new airborne operation referred to as Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in human history with 38,000 paratroopers jumping into Nazi-occupied Holland. Hearing that he was going to be jumping into Holland, Jake figured that he was going to be engaging in a lot of close quarters combat, so he opted to turn in his M1 Grand and get a Thompson, which is exactly what he did. He then received word that his platoon, being the bridge experts that they are, were going to have to go out, capture a bunch of bridges, defend them, and or get rid of them until they heard word otherwise. And pretty much everything goes according to plan there. They jump in, they get to the bridge, they take the bridge over, they hold it for a couple of weeks. Then they receive word that they are to go help another unit take over this town known as Eindhoven. So Jake and his men make their way over to Eindhoven, and they begin helping to clear out this town, room by room, building by building, close quarters combat, them versus the Germans. In his book, Jake described this close quarter combat as very different from what you see today. It wasn't 4 troops stacked up outside a door, kicking it in, and all running into the other. It was one guy, one room. An American would kick open the door, throw in a frag grenade. As soon as the frag grenade blew up, the American would then crawl in on his hands and knees with a Thompson submachine gun and shoot anybody that survived. The reason they crawled in on their hands and knees is because, according to Jake, the grenade would kick up so much dust and soot and debris in these old buildings that you couldn't see standing at normal levels. So you had to drop down like you were in a fire trying to avoid carbon monoxide to be able to see what you were doing. And this is how they cleared the entire village, making their way all the way through. About halfway through, Jake would be clearing the building where somebody clearly used to make furniture. At which point, Jake would find a chicken. Now, this chicken had 6 eggs. Finding eggs in the middle of a war zone in World War II was a big deal. Nobody had eggs, and Jake fucking loves eggs, okay? This is amazing. Only problem, he's got to figure out how to get these 6 eggs all the way through this village without breaking. So he thinks to himself for a second, maybe I can leave the eggs here and I'll come back for them later. And he's like, no, that's not going to work because one of these other paratroopers is going to find my eggs I want. So he takes all the eggs and sticks them in the cargo pocket of his pants. And then, every time he clears a room, rather than crawling in on his arms and legs, he slides in on one side, the side without the eggs, to ensure that he doesn't damage any of his precious eggs, which is the most gangster shit I've ever heard in my entire life. This dude is going toe-to-toe in close quarters combat against enemies with submachine guns trying to kill him, and his primary concern is not fucking up breakfast. This is like a stupid video game achievement for when you want to play it on extra hardcore mode. It's almost like this man knows that he has plot armor. It's absolutely incredible. So he continues to go on, clears out the entire village, doesn't break a single egg. It's absolutely incredible. They get to the other side of the village, they're like, sweet! Cleared out all the Germans, and then across the field, out of the wood line, pulls an entire German mechanized unit with 10 tanks. At this point, Jake is like, I just want to eat my fucking eggs. This sucks. So Jake and the Filthy 13 go to work, being the demolition men. It's their job to go around to the tanks and disable their tracks so they can no longer move, and then the infantry's going to come in with their flamethrowers and cook the enemy out. And that's exactly what happens. Everything goes according to plan. They take out all 10 tanks. Not really that big of a deal. Jake reaches into his pocket. Tragedy strikes. He's broken a single egg. It only took 10 German tanks to make this guy fumble enough to break a single egg, and he got to enjoy 5 eggs for dinner that night. Jake and his men then adopt a holding position where they would chill out for a little bit, hold their position until they got evac again for yet another huge mission where Jake and his men would find themselves back in France for a second time. So Jake and his men find themselves at an army base right outside of Reims, France. Obviously, Jake and his men want to go drink in town, have a good time, see if they can find some women, you know, what have you. The only problem is, apparently the 82nd Airborne was there last month, and the 82nd Airborne caused such an issue in town that the military had to bring in a special group of MPs to get the 82nd Airborne under control, and now all paratroopers have been effectively banned from town. I mean, to be fair, that's pretty on brand for the 82nd Airborne. Bunch of rowdy dudes. If you don't know, that's their logo. On paper, AA stands for All American, but everybody knows that it actually stands for Athletic Alcoholics. Now, Jake, wanting to drink anyways, comes up with a plan. He's got to hook up with a distillery all the way over in Paris, which is like a 2-day trip away. So, Jake gets a 72-hour pass, starts leaving to go to Paris. His commanding officer stops him and is like, Jake, what are you doing? I'm going to Paris to get some booze for the boys. Jake, Paris is 2 days away. Do you really think that you're going to be able to take 2 days to travel to Paris, go on a week-long bender, and then travel 2 days back, all in 72 hours. At which point, Jake looks at the officer and says, and I quote, "I don't know. I wouldn't be willing to bet on it, but I'm willing to try." At which point, the officer kind of just rolls his eyes and is like, "Is there anything I can do to stop you?" Jake, not really, so the officer just lets him go, because he realizes that Jake's going no matter what. It's just a matter of if he wants to get his ass beat in the trigger. So Jake makes his way to Paris, goes on a couple-day bender, gets a bunch of booze for the boys, heads back to base. He finally gets back. He's been AWOL for 5 days. They immediately throw him in the stockade for abandoning his post, at which point his command comes up to him and is like, "Jake, we've been talking. We really want you to volunteer for Pathfinder School." At which point, Jake kind of has a little bit of a panic attack. He's like, "They're trying to kill me. Like, they're actively trying to kill me." You see, if you don't know what a Pathfinder is, they're basically paratroopers, but they go out hours or a day before the big, huge paratrooper operation, and they jump beforehand, and then they figure out the best spot to drop all the other paratroopers and radio it back to base so they know where to put everyone. This job during World War II was incredibly dangerous. On a given airborne operation, it required 2 Pathfinders and 1 set of radio equipment to get the mission done. And on every mission, they would drop 10 Pathfinders and 2 sets of equipment, because they knew that on average, 8 of them were going to die and 1 set of equipment was going to be damaged or lost. They had an 80% fatality rate on any one mission at any point during World War II. And that is why Jake thought for sure they're trying to get me killed. The only silver lining here is they can't make him do it, because Pathfinder is so dangerous that it was strictly a voluntary basis only. But Jake wasn't one to act too quick, so he said he'd think about it. And he goes and he thinks about it, and he's thinking about the war, and he starts to think to himself, you know, Pathfinder School's all the way over in England. By the time they send me there, I start school, I finish school, there's a good chance this war might be over altogether, and I'm not going to have to make another combat jump. It'll be great. So he's like kind of on the fence about it now, and then he really starts thinking about it. He's like, man, Pathfinder School's at an Air Force base, and even back in World War II, the Air Force had way better food than the Army. So now he might not have to do any more combat jumps, and he's going to get some good food. And then it dawns on him. The Air Force base where they teach Pathfinder School is 8 miles down the road from Oxford University, and all the young British men are fighting a war right now, meaning that Oxford is just full of college chicks. And as Jake said himself, and I quote, "This seemed like a mighty fine opportunity to do some postgraduate work." Fucking love this guy. So Jake shows up to Pathfinder School, and he's immediately called into the commander's office, which is weird because he hasn't even done anything wrong yet. Jake goes in there, and the commander's like, "Hi Jake, I've heard all about you. I want you to be acting first sergeant." At which point Jake is like, "I don't know what you heard about me, but you heard wrong. I'm technically not even private first class yet. I've never been promoted. I am not the leader that you want. I don't care about saluting. I don't care about any of that dog and pony show military stuff. I'm here to fight a war, and that's it." At which point the commander's like, "That's exactly why I want you. I don't need you to salute me. I don't need you to call me sir. I need you to get these guys ready for war, and I don't think there's anybody better to do it than you. I'll make sure that you end up getting paid as a first sergeant the entire time you're an acting first sergeant." To which Jake replies, I don't really care about the money. Look, I've blown up every safe between here and Normandy. I have plenty of money, okay? I might be willing to do this job, but if I'm going to do it, there's going to be some terms. Anybody that's fighting for me is going to keep having good Air Force food, and they get permanent leave whenever they want. At that point, the commander agrees. Jake is now the acting first sergeant, which, if you don't know, is the polar opposites of the spectrum as far as enlisted rank goes. So, per usual, Jake excels at pretty much everything over at Pathfinder School. They graduate, Jake is still acting first sergeant, and he gets to decide which person is in which platoon. So naturally, Jake does what anybody would do, and he builds a dream team of the 20 best Pathfinders out of all 400 and puts himself with that platoon. Now, at this point, it's really looking like Jake might never have to go out on a mission as a Pathfinder because the war is really dwindling down at this point. Then, December 16th, 1944, the Germans launch a last-ditch effort counteroffensive to try to fight Allied forces. This would be known as the Battle of the Bulge, where they would cut off the 101st Airborne, Jake's old division, inside the town of Bastogne, completely surround them, and the 101st Airborne is now stuck in this city. They are running out of ammunition, they're running out of food, and they're running out of gas. And if they end up surrendering, it can turn the entire tide of World War II. So, all they need is they need somebody to be able to parachute in, get in town, and be able to call in resupply drops to let the 101st Airborne have a fighting chance to be able to hold off the Germans long enough for Patton to show up with his army of 350,000 men. So, you've got a crazy mission, somebody needs to save the day, you're calling upon Jake and his dream team. There hasn't been a single radio transmission to come out of the 101st Airborne in over 2 days. Despite that, Jake and his dream... With Chevy
Equinox EV, you get the tech you want with a best-in-class 17.7-inch touchscreen. A vehicle you know, value you'd expect, and a dealer right down the street. Go EV without changing a thing. Chevrolet, together let's drive.
Iris and Nicole are reuniting for the next big endeavor.
We decided to turn.
Green team are going to jump in anyways. They have to be able to hit a 2-mile diameter landing zone while jumping out of a plane that's traveling 160 miles an hour, utilizing parachutes that they can't steer. This mission is seemingly impossible, but here they go. They jump out of the planes, they hit the landing zone perfectly. One man, unfortunately, does die, but that is a 5% fatality rate compared to the average of 80. Jake and his men then immediately get to work setting up their equipment in opposite sides of town. And after one guy calls in one resupply, he picks up his stuff, moves to a different location. Then this guy calls in his resupply, picks up, moves to a different location, and they bounce the signal back and forth on opposite sides of town all day, sending signals for resupply. They do this because they know the Germans can triangulate the radio equipment and don't want them to start utilizing artillery to take them out. Within the first 24 hours of Jake and his men landing, they called in 247 C-47s for resupply flights. On the second day, they were able to call in 160. On the third day, they were able to call in 140. On the fourth day, they were able to call in 269. And on the fifth day, they were able to call in 129. Jake and his men have single-handedly provided the 101st Airborne Division with enough resupply to be able to stave off the Germans, to give Patton enough time to show up with his army and penetrate through the German flank, effectively ending World War II in the European theater and potentially saving the entire war as a whole. So Jake has effectively saved the day. It is now time to get out of there, get retooled, refitted, and probably never make another combat jump again, because for sure the war is over this time. Right? Wrong. Apparently Patton gets in some trouble. He gets some hotshot Pathfinders to jump into Prim, Germany, and call in resupply for him. So they're going to Jake and his crew yet again. Jake jumps in, saves the day for a fourth time, becoming one of the only men in history to conduct 4 combat jumps during World War II. At that point, the war is basically over, and they adopt a holding position where they pretty much just party in Germany for the rest of the time. Now, as fate would have it, Jake and his men and some of the rest of the 101st Airborne would end up taking refuge in the abandoned castle of Hermann Göring, like one of the biggest Nazi leaders during World War II. And oddly enough, a bunch of the spoils from all the countries that Germany has invaded all found their way to his castle. Fancy booze, fancy wine, and apparently he was a racehorse fan because every famous racehorse from every country that Germany invaded had made its way back to his castle. So Jake, the Filthy 13, a bunch of other 101st guys are sitting there getting drunk on fancy wine, fancy whiskey, and there's like $100 million worth of racehorse sitting in the barn, at which point they're like, let's throw on a rodeo for all the townspeople, right? Right. And that's exactly what they do. So you've got a bunch of drunk paratroopers riding around all these fancy racehorses. It's a great time. And then my personal favorite part of this entire story, while out at the rodeo, Jake would meet an attractive young lady by the name of Amelia. And Jake and Amelia would immediately hit it off and start doing some postgraduate work. I mean, dating. Oh, don't worry, it gets better. As it would turn out, Amelia's father is the leader of the local chapter of Hitler's Youth, which is just the absolute cherry on top to this entire story. How's the saying go? Screw you and the horse you rode in on. Jake's like, nah, I'm gonna raid your liquor cabinet, steal your horse, ride in on it, and then bang your daughter. This is the best possible ending to this man's epic saga in World War II that anybody can even come up with, and it happened in real life. Just to recap, Jake jumps into D-Day, wrecks house. Then jumps into Holland, wrecks house, and then eats some eggs about it. Then he pretty much single-handedly turned the tide of the Battle of the Bulge, and then he proceeds to find the closest thing he can to a Nazi princess and show her that inches are in fact better than centimeters. Shortly after that, Jake would get sent back home to America, where they would then reroute him to Arkansas so that he could see a plastic surgeon about getting his ear repaired because it had gotten mangled during one of his exploits. While in Arkansas, he would have a run-in with the military police, get in a fight with them, get thrown in the stockade yet again. Before being released, the military police commander would inform him after he gets his ears fixed, they don't ever want to see him on their post again, at which point Jake, being Jake, informs the military police commander, hey, if you ever see me again, I'm going to be a civilian and you're going to be the one with the fucking problem because I'm going to kick your ass. At which point, the military police commander files charges on Jake, and Jake is immediately chaptered out of the U.S. Army, officially ending his military career after only 3 years, 5 months, and 26 days. Because that's just how it goes for the anti-heroes. They are absolutely necessary in a time of war and not tolerated whatsoever during a time of peace. citizens. Jake didn't really mind though, he had accomplished what he set out to do, plus he had a huge hoard of cash that he had liberated from all the safes that he ran across in Europe. At that point in time, he goes on to explore his own alcoholism, going from place to place, town to town, job to job, just kind of doing his own thing. He ends up getting in a ton of bar fights, not because Jake instigates them, but because every local tough guy hears Jake's a paratrooper, and they want to prove how tough they are, but ultimately the only thing they proved is that they could fall down. Then, after a number of years, Jake would have a near miss with a drunk driving accident where he would almost drive his car into a concrete wall, in his own words, only missing it by a coat of paint. Because of that, Jake would decide that he needs to change his own ways. He would defeat his alcoholism, he would find God, he would start going to church every Sunday, he would find a wife, he would have some kids, and he would live happily ever after, working at the post office in his hometown of Ponca City, Oklahoma, selling stamps and slinging packages, and nobody was none the wiser that their friendly neighborhood mailman was one of, if not the greatest anti-hero of all time. So in conclusion, it's hard to put into words what an anti-hero is, but you know it when you see it. However, the best definition I have ever heard comes from Jake McNasty McNeese himself. When asked in an interview later in life how he managed to survive all of his crazy exploits, he said, and I quote, "I think I made it because God didn't have anywhere to put me. At that point in time, he was so busy, he was only putting people in one or two places, heaven or hell. And I think he knew that I would have goofed up either one. So here I am. And I think that might be the closest thing to a perfect definition that we're ever going to get when it comes to defining what an anti-hero is. So, thank you for watching. The best way to support the channel is to go buy some merch. Fabulous.com. Crack bang. Out.
Well, I said retreat that evening, and then went in town that night, and all picture on. The old place was mistreating, really mistreating the soldier boy. I stepped in and told him to stop it, and said, we'll do it anytime we want to. So I took their nightsticks away from them, beat them to the ground, and then I took the 45 off of me, showed up all the street lights and everything around there, and I wasn't shooting at any people, I just shooting one. Then we went on in with them, stalking, and I never did have to stand retreat again.
Old Spice Gentleman's Super Hydration Body Wash. An Avalanche. 24/7 moisturization with vitamin B3.
This is one of those stories that if they ever actually try to make a movie out of it, they will intentionally ruin it. When I started this video, I just wanted to know how the tanks made it onto the beaches at D-Day, and what I found instead is one of the greatest anti-hero stories of all time, and it rewrote my understanding of history. Today we're talking about the man that quite literally wrote the book on armored warfare, a World War I veteran that was forced into early retirement because his fellow officers didn't like him very much. But after German tanks rampaged through France and North Africa utilizing their new blitzkrieg tactic, Winston Churchill himself would call upon this man to leave retirement and go toe-to-toe with the infamous German tank commanders Erwin Rommel and Heinz Guderian. Ladies and gentlemen, the hero of D-Day that you've probably never heard of, Major General Sir Percy Cleghorn Stanley Hobart, a.k.a. Hobo. But first, a word from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by Delete Me. Delete Me is an online subscription service. It's a very straightforward, simple business. You give them money, person will delete the delivery, and they'll mail it for you. A couple days for all of them. He may all have a late anti-hero fashion. He made a name for himself as being extremely effective, but unorthodox and disobedient at the same time. Because of this, many of the other British officers don't really care for him. Despite that, he makes it through World War I, ends up earning himself a military cross, and then in 1919 he goes off to college. Graduates from college 4 years later in 1923, he then volunteers to be an officer in the Royal Tank Corps. Now, he volunteered because most people did not want this position. And that's because at this point in time, a lot of the high-ranking British officers didn't see the true potential that tanks and armored vehicles had. They simply viewed them as a single tool for trench warfare to get from one trench to the other. They didn't realize that one day it was going to replace cavalry. Percy Hobart, on the other hand, was a visionary and saw its true potential, and that's why he volunteered. Not only that, he was also very vocal about this opinion, and he would actually persuade a lot of the younger soldiers to believe the same thing, which honestly isn't a very hard sell. The new guy joins the army, and you're like, hey, quick question, did you want to ride a horse into battle, or did you want to drive a fucking tank? Hey, everybody's picking a tank. And over time, his advocacy for change ends up making a lot of the old cavalry officers end up hating him because he's kind of trying to make them obsolete. And you have to remember, at this point in time, the British officer corps is very, very cliquey, like they're socialites and gentlemen, and they have to, conduct themselves in a certain manner and all that BS. So when Hobart comes in, and starts ruffling feathers, it upsets the entire officer corps, and they all pretty much hate him at this point. Despite that, he knows he's right, and he just keeps working on pioneering new tactics and new applications for tanks. Now, one of the few legitimate concerns about having tanks on the battlefield at this point in time was that they were basically autonomous. And what I mean by that is, once the tank crew got their orders, hopped in the tank, and took off, that was it. Because tanks didn't have radios and stuff yet at this point in time. So once they left, you couldn't call them back, you couldn't change up the mission, they couldn't communicate with anybody outside of that tank. So Hobart comes out and he's like, well, hey, rather than not using tanks because they can't communicate, how about we just, I don't know, put some radios inside of them? So he fights tooth and nail for like a year to make that happen, gets radios put in all of his tanks, and then trains his guys how to run battle drills, being able to actually communicate with each other and the chain of command, and guess what? It works exactly how you would expect it to. I mean, this is the upside-down ketchup bottle of the tank world. Like, somebody finally came out with this idea, and everybody's like, how? How did I not come up with that billion-dollar idea? At this point, all the junior officers and lower enlisted are like, holy shit, this is awesome. And all the older, more experienced officers that already hated Hobart lose their shit because he's now actively making them look stupid.
What are those you are wearing? Take a knife!
So once that gets worked out, he starts developing legitimate battle strategies and drills and training his men on how to conduct tank warfare, how to integrate tanks with infantry, really laying the groundwork for what would become modern tank warfare. This goes on for a couple of years, and then in 1927, he ends up being a co-respondent in a divorce case. Now, I'll be honest, I had to Google what that meant, but apparently co-respondent is the fancy British officer polite way of saying Percy Hobart was banging somebody else's wife. Her name was Dorothea Field, and of course, she was another British officer's wife.
Naughty. I'm done spending an obscene amount of money on to get everything done.
I'm getting back on track with Factor. Fresh, never frozen meals with Aaron Chef. This saves us so much time when we're introducing around our toddler. I can get all the nutrition I need without.
After that divorce is finalized, Dorothea and Percy get married pretty much immediately, and the rest of the officer corps now absolutely hates him, and they actively try to get him kicked out of the military because this is not gentlemanly behavior. They're not able to get it done. Hobart stays in the military and continues to develop and refine armored warfare. And one of the things he starts to do is look back into history and see if there's any lessons that he can apply to tank warfare. And one of the things that he hones in on is the Mongols. The Mongols were so successful because they utilized cavalry to strike deep into enemy territory at strategic points, weakening their entire empire. And Hobart says, what if I could do the same thing, but with tanks? And to anybody that knows a lot about history, that sounds an awful lot like the German Blitzkrieg tactic, and that's because it is. Yeah, the Germans didn't come up with the Blitzkrieg, Percy Hobart did. Heinz Genderman, the German tank commander that is the architect of the Blitzkrieg, is well known to have had every single paper that Percy Hobart published translated into German, and he kept that with him everywhere he went. Yeah, the infamous German tank commanders Rommel and Genderman didn't revolutionize armored warfare, they just copied Hobart's homework. So if Percy Hobart is the actual genius behind the Blitzkrieg, why don't most people know that? Why does everybody give Germany credit, and why didn't the British use it first? Or at the very least, know that it was a possibility when it was used against them in France when they got their asses beat in 6 weeks. That is because the British chain of command hated the man that came up with the Blitzkrieg, and for that reason made the entire strategy a failure. In 1934, Britain conducted a large training exercise where Percy Hobart was going to be allowed to try out his new methods. If you don't know, when you're conducting a large military training exercise, you have like Team A, Team B, and then you have the umpires, so to speak. You have the people making sure that both teams are doing the right things, saying, yeah, that works, no, that doesn't work, declaring who wins and who loses. The umpires conspired against Hobart because they were military officers and they didn't like him, and basically made his entire strategy fail. Fast forward 1937, Hobart is given command of the 1st Armored Division, Great Britain's first modern tank division. Because of this, a bunch of British officers promptly throw a bitch fit and try to get Hobart kicked out of the military. Again, it fails again, but the chain of command has to come up with a compromise, and that compromise is to take Hobart and send him down to Egypt, where he can take command of the 2nd Armored Division, which was basically, we're going to ship him halfway across the world and then pretend he doesn't exist. Out of sight, out of mind. Right? So Hobart gets down to Egypt, and it is a complete shit show because tanks are effectively replacing cavalry at this point, so it's cavalry officers that are running tank divisions, and they have chosen to not read any of the literature or training material that he has spent the last decade developing, and they are operating tanks like they are dragoons. If you don't know, a dragoon is kind of like cavalry, except it's not. They ride in on horses, and then they dismount and go into battle on foot. And that's what the 2nd Armored division is being trained to do. They roll up in the tank, and then the gunner and the loader stay in the tank while the rest of the crew gets out and fights like infantry, while being a static target instead of a moving target, which is the entire point of being a fucking tank. The chain of command is effectively trying to do everything they can to make tanks look bad and ineffective, because by extension it makes Hobart look bad and ineffective. The running joke when Hobart gets there is that the Egyptian force is the Egyptian farce, and the mobile division is the immobile division. But when Hobart shows up, he turns the entire thing around. Between 1930 and 1940, he trains this entire division how to actually conduct tank warfare, and they get super effective at it. And the men absolutely love it. Because Percy Hobart is not only a great teacher, but he actually wants every man under his command to understand what they are doing and why they are doing it. When at this point in time, many other officers don't care about that. They just want you to shut up and follow orders. But Percy Hobart wants you to know what you should be doing and why you should be doing it. That way, if the chain of command ever fails, you can make intelligent decisions regarding what needs to be done. In short, Percy Hobart treats his men like they're grown-ass men, and they absolutely love him for it. And because of that, he gains overwhelming support from the junior officers and enlisted men, and he becomes immensely popular.
No, don't like that.
And because of this, they finally force him out of the military, because they sent him down to Africa, intentionally sabotaged him, and yet again, he's managed to turn the entire situation around and turns it into a positive thing. So they just end up getting him fired. In 1940, he is forced into early retirement. On his final departure from Egypt, the men of the 2nd Armored Division lined the entire road to wish him farewell as their sign of how much they actually respected this man. So Percy goes back home, but still wanting to be involved in the military, he joins the Home Guard, which is like the British equivalent of the National Guard. And he gets busted down from Lieutenant General to Corporal, which if you don't know military ranks, is like going from CEO to front desk receptionist. Not that I'm trying to talk bad about receptionists, but I'm trying to give you an accurate depiction of what a drastic change in authority this is. 5 months after Hobart's forced into retirement, the German military rolls into France with tanks, utilizing the blitzkrieg tactic that Percy Hobart designed, and completely stomps the British and the French army in a matter of 6 weeks. Erwin Rommel then goes and proceeds to rampage through North Africa, and the only people that even kind of slow him down are Hobart's men of the 2nd Armored Division, that is now known as the 7th Armored Division, aka the Desert Rats. At this point, Winston Churchill starts asking questions and realizes what his officer corps has done, and he personally calls Percy Hobart back into service and awards him the rank of Major General, at which point all of the officers throw a fit yet again, saying that he's 57 years old, he's too old to serve in the military, and they try to get him med boarded out. Winston Churchill yet again intervenes and stops the med board and issues this statement, quote, "The high commands of the Army are not a club. It is my duty to make sure exceptionally able men, even though not popular with their military contemporaries, are not prevented from giving their services to the crown." Translation, quit being a bunch of catty bitches, we need this guy.
What comes to mind immediately with Enclave is really this effortless beauty.
There's a multitude of different things to help create this first-class experience. So through quiet tuning, through continuous stamping.
By the time all that political BS gets done, Rommel is back in Europe, and he has been tasked with fortifying the Atlantic Wall, the German defense from Norway to Spain, in case the Allies should invade. Rommel reinforces it with 260,000 men manning over 15,000 concrete bunkers and artillery positions. The entire thing is coated with barbed wire. It has anti-vehicle emplacements to prevent tanks and other vehicles from getting up the beach. And they lay over 200 million mines. And the man put in charge of figuring out how to penetrate those defenses is none other than Percy Hobart. He has re-entered the picture, and he knows that these kids have been stealing his homework. He comes in with the complete dad energy of, I taught you everything you know, but I didn't teach you everything I know. He takes command of the 79th Tank Regiment and gets to work immediately. It is now Major General Hobart or Erwin Rommel going toe-to-toe in a battle of blitz that will determine the fate of the world. And obviously, we're going to handle this issue with tanks, which brings us to problem number 1. How are we going to get tanks on the beach? How are we going to get a 70,000-pound hunk of metal with a gun from the boat through the water onto the beach? Obviously, we just got to make a tank float, and it can't be that hard because battleships float, right? I mean, those are big and heavy and made out of metal, so why can't we do the same thing with the tank? All you have to do is displace enough water, and bada bing, bada boom, you're floating. So all we got to do is increase the surface area of a tank. So they take a gigantic tube of wax canvas, wrap it around the tank, and then have inflatable tubes that when they inflate it, the canvas stands straight up, and basically it is a tank inside of a giant canvas tube. And then we'll just add a couple of little boat propellers on the back of the tank so it'll push itself through the water. Problem solved. Sounds stupid, works terrific. So now that we've got the Sherman duplex drive amphibious tank figured out, the next problem, what is the beach made out of? Are the tanks going to get hung up and stuck? Because we can't have that happening either. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a submarine. We're going to send them out. They're going to wait until night. Once night falls, the sailors are going to go ashore, gather up a bunch of the dirt from the beach, and figure out what it's made out of. It's made out of blue clay. Probably the worst possible thing because those tanks will for sure get stuck in clay. So obviously problem number 2, how on earth are we going to get the tanks through all this blue clay? It would be really nice if we had a road. You know what? Fuck it. We're just going to bring our own road. Ladies and gentlemen, the bobbin. That is a Churchill tank with a gigantic spool of canvas that has metal rods inside of it that literally goes ahead first and lays down a road for all the other tanks to drive on right up the beach. Again, it looks really silly, but it works super well. At this point, all the other people that hate Hobart are starting to make fun of them. They're starting to refer to these tanks as Hobart's funnies, but they have no idea how important Hobart is over here actually trying to save the world by any means necessary. He realizes it doesn't matter how cool it looks, he just needs it to work, and he only needs it to work once. Meanwhile, all of his other contemporaries are worried about looking good while they do it. Okay, problem number 3, marching right up the beach. Now we have to worry about the mines and the barbed wire. We can't be blowing the tracks off our tanks with mines. We need to clear the barbed wire for the men, and we don't want the barbed wire getting hung up in the tracks of the tank. What are we going to do? Things are about to go from looking weird and silly to looking terrifying and awesome because the plan for this is to eat the barbed wire and blow up the mines in front of us using the Sherman Crab, aka the flail tank. Okay, so just so we're on the same page, in theory, we have now figured out how to sail a fucking tank a mile through the ocean, build a road in front of us as we drive it up the beach, cut through barbed wire, and detonate mines. The only defensive structure left is the enormous concrete bunkers with Germans inside shooting machine guns and mortars. What are we going to do about them? Because normal tank guns aren't going to take those out effectively. Which is a pretty simple solution. If your gun isn't big enough, just get a bigger gun. Ladies and gentlemen, the petard. It is essentially a mortar that is the size of a propane tank, affectionately dubbed the Flying Dustbin.
You call that big?
That thing's huge.
That explains a lot.
What is that supposed to mean?
You told me 8 inches.
And you told me you took installments.